Villa Park, home of Aston Villa Football Club, one of the most successful clubs in English football history. They've been champions of England's top flight 7 times and have reached the FA Cup final 10 times, winning on 7 of those occasions. One of their greatest achievements was in 1982 when they beat Bayern Munich 1-0 to win the European Cup, now the Champions League.
Oh, it must be! And it is! Peter Will! Villa in the lead!
Villa have a whole host of stars in their history. Charlie Aitken, a Scottish international, played a record 660 games from 1961 to 1976. Other Villa stars include Brian Little, who played as a midfielder or striker from 1972 to 79. His incredible balance and pace could leave players standing. Former club captain Gareth Southgate is Villa's most capped player, having played 57 times for England. He played for Villa from 1995 to 2001. And this is the building where it all began, the Aston Villa Wesleyan Chapel. That chapel has gone now, and what's in its place is the red brick building that we see opposite. However, next door, this red brick building was the original Bible class attended by some 300 young students. One of the classes was run by a man called Henry Hartshorn, and his Bible class was the cradle of Aston Villa Football Club. In fact, they formed a cricket team here from that Bible class called Aston Villa Wesleyan Cricket Team. Significantly, 4 of those members, and their names were Jack Hughes, Frederick Matthews, William Scattergood, Walter Price. Those 4 were delegated to watch a football match that was taking place up the road round here in Heathfield Road. They were keen to see what its potential was for themselves. The game that they saw was a little bit too physical for their liking, so they came here to Villa Cross and stood under a lamppost, we're told, somewhere on this site, to discuss what they'd seen and to suggest what they should report back to the others. And they felt that the game they ought to consider was this new one, only 11 years old, called association football, which was far less physical than the form of the game they'd seen, which was more like rugby. And so they reported back, and it was decided that they would form a football club. And the name given was Aston Villa Wesleyan Football Club. And that decision was taken in February 1874 here at Villa Cross. By the way, the name Villa Cross comes from the fact that on this site here stood a former Georgian villa, which gave its name to many of the streets in the locality and, of course, to the Aston Villa Wesleyan Chapel, which stood over there. One of those 4 players, Jack Hughes, achieved immortality by becoming the first goal scorer in Aston Villa's history. That was a month after the meeting here at Villa Cross, when Aston Villa Wesleyan Football Club played another local team, Aston Brooks St Mary's, in a 15-a-side game, half the game according to rugby rules, half the game according to association football rules, because there weren't at that time many teams that played association football. The game was won 1-0 and Jack Hughes became the scorer. This impressive building is Aston Hall, the home of Sir Thomas Holt, who started building it in 1618. He's commemorated very visibly at the home end of Villa Park, which is just across the road from Aston Park, the former deer park of Aston Hall. It became known as the Football Nursery of Birmingham. And here, in the 1875-76 season, Villa started to take their football seriously and played a full programme of fixtures. But they also practised here. And one particular spring morning in 1876, a young man from Scotland came across these lads playing and asked if he could join in. His name was George Ramsey, a 20-year-old Glaswegian who'd come to Birmingham in search of work. He so mesmerised these Villa players with his dazzling skills that they immediately said, "Come and join us." And he did. and it was an association that was to last for the rest of his life. Under George Ramsay's inspired leadership, Aston Villa went from strength to strength, and it was pretty obvious they needed a home of their own if they were going to develop. After all, they were sharing Aston Park with so many other local teams. The opportunity for real growth came when one Sunday afternoon, George Ramsay and his friend Jemmy Lindsay were taking a stroll out in the countryside at Perry Bar, here. And they came across some grazing land which they thought would be absolutely ideal for a football pitch. And they negotiated with the owner, and it was agreed that they could hire this land. And it became the Perry Bar ground. Villa's fame began to spread, and word of this club reached a Scotsman called William McGregor, who'd heard that not only was this a good club, one worth watching, but also that there were many other Scotsmen there, and he was immediately drawn to meet them. He came to Perry Bar, he met George Ramsay, they became firm friends, and Ramsay persuaded him to become a member of Aston Villa Football Club. A year later, at McGregor's suggestion, the Scottish national symbol of the lion rampant was adopted as the club's emblem. In fact, one of Aston Villa's nicknames today is the Lions. At the time, the club's headquarters was the old Crown and Cushion Coaching Inn. Not exactly the best choice when you realise that a lot of those players like their drink. Some of them failed to turn up for training, some turned up to matches completely drunk. And so it was McGregor, who was now on board and a lifelong teetotaler, who decided something drastic had to be done. And he compelled those players to attend a social evening where they listened to musical performances on Monday evenings as a way of instilling good habits into them. And it seemed to work, because not too long afterwards, this club really started to achieve big things. So who was William McGregor? He was born in Perthshire in January 1846, his early years being spent in the picturesque village of Braco. He was baptised here in the parish church in the village. While quite young, he and his family moved north to Perth, where he trained as an apprentice draper. Then, at the age of 24, he moved south to Birmingham, where he opened his own draper's shop on this site, working here for the rest of his life. When William McGregor came to Birmingham in 1870, he immediately associated himself with the Wheeler Street Congregational Chapel, which stood here on this site. He was here for 40 years. It was his church until the day he died. In fact, his pastor, W.G. Percival, said of McGregor that beyond all else in his life, the most important thing was his Christian faith. He in fact described him as a man of absolutely unblemished character, something that was echoed by many people in the world of football afterwards. Another important landmark in McGregor's life in Birmingham is here in Alma Street, on this very unlikely site. In fact, it's also one of the most important locations in the history of football. Let me tell you about it. It all started in 1880 when Villa won their first trophy, the Birmingham Senior Cup. From that time, the club just got bigger and bigger. And in fact, they started to pay their players loss of earnings if they'd taken time off from factories to play, and also expenses. This was totally against the purest amateur spirit of the day. And in fact, in 1884, McGregor actually stood up at a very important meeting involving the Football Association and courageously declared that they, among others, were actually paying players for loss of earnings and for expenses. A year later, professionalism was legalised, and Villa took the opportunity to turn professional. But this presented its own problems, because now the club was totally dependent on income from gates to generate the money they needed to pay the players. And this meant they had to be sure that there would be good gates generated from playing against good teams. But unfortunately, this didn't always happen. Very often, a team would turn up with too few players and would have to enlist spectators to make up the numbers, or if they found attractive opposition elsewhere, they just wouldn't bother turning up. All of these sorts of situations made spectators reluctant to go to matches because they didn't know if they'd have a game to watch. And with these declining gates, there became real problems for clubs who had to pay their players. And it was such a serious problem that one winter's evening in 1886, here in Joe Tillotson's coffee house, Joe Tillotson was a very close friend of McGregor, they discussed the situation. And McGregor hit upon the idea that what was needed was what he called a fixity of fixtures, where clubs could be sure that matches would take place. And his idea was that a group of clubs should agree to play each other on a home and away basis on fixed dates for points. It was the birth of the idea of the Football League. With this in mind, McGregor then started to sound out opinion across the country. He wrote a letter to 5 clubs to see what sort of feedback he would get. And in the end of March in 1888, on the eve of the Cup final, he met with more clubs to sound out opinions. Again, a very positive response. And this led to a final meeting in Manchester at the Royal Hotel on the 17th of April 1888, where it was agreed that the Football League should be formed. And in September of that year, the first matches took place on a glorious sunny afternoon. That league, the idea for which was born here on this unlikely site, went from strength to strength. Within only 5 years, it had grown from 12 to 31 clubs, from 1 division to 2. And McGregor, who ran it, was seen to be one of the most able administrators possible. It was said of him he had no superior, if an equal, in the council chambers of the game. And also, he was not some stuffy administrator, as people often think the Victorians were. He was a man of whom it was said the chief characteristic of Mr. McGregor was the smile on his face and the twinkle in his eye. He was a man who positively radiated joy.
William McGregor died in 1911 and was buried here in the graveyard of St Mary's Church in Handsworth. The tributes flowed in. The Birmingham Gazette called him a man of the highest integrity, while the president of the Birmingham County Football Association said he stood for all that was best and cleanest in the great game of football. On the centenary of his death, Aston Villa commissioned the restoration of his grave, which was rededicated at a special service attended by Lord Brian Morwinnie, president of the Football League, and representatives of its founding clubs. It was led by Brian Hall, who was assisted by some of the country's leading clergy.
Well, Brian, here we are again. It was a very special day, the 20th of December 2011, wasn't it?
Very memorable occasion, yes. And this man, William McGregor, brought together so many different sorts of people. The whole of the representatives from the football world, as one might expect, the members of the original league. And then there were all the church people that he brought together.
And I think McGregor would have been pleased at what we said about him in respect of his Christian faith.
I hope so. He actually seems to have been a very humble man as well,
yes,
from what I've gathered.
Yes.
But McGregor's restored grave isn't the only memorial with which Aston Villa has honoured his memory. In 2009, this impressive bronze statue of him was erected in front of the Trinity Road stand. And today, his influence is still appreciated, as Aston Villa's chaplain Ken Baker explains.
Ken, you're a great admirer of William McGregor, aren't you?
Yes, most definitely. He's been a great ambassador for us here, and his name's always mentioned within the club. It's a good club from a spiritual point of view, and it's good to have the William McGregor arrangement with us, because he was an excellent man and a very spiritual man, and people are aware of that, which is good. And whilst he does have a good track record football-wise with this particular club, and as you know, spearheaded many things in the early days, and having won the league, 5 times in the 1890s, and so he's a first-class man to have on, I would say, on our books really, and to have the statue at the front of at Villa Park is very good for the club.
What an inspirational man. What a Christian. It's clear that the personal relationship he enjoyed with Christ was the mainspring of all that he did, all that he was. His joy, his integrity, his courage. He was a beacon not only to his generation, but to ours too. Aston Villa can be very proud of this illustrious pioneer.
I've come to Oakwell Stadium, home of Barnsley Football Club and twice FA Cup finalists and winners in 1912. We'll hear more about that shortly. This is the club that produced Tommy Taylor, the legendary England striker who achieved fame at Manchester United and sadly died in 1958 in the Munich air disaster. Others who made their mark include Mick McCarthy, with over 300 appearances up to his departure in 1983. He went on to manage the Republic of Ireland. Barry Murphy holds the club record of 567 appearances during the 1960s and 70s. The ground here was acquired for the club by an unlikely young man who was also its founder. Let's find out more about him and how Barnsley Football Club was born.
It all started with a man called Tiverton Preedy, who in 1887, at the age of 24, came to Barnsley as a curate at St. Peter's Church. Now, it's not the grand building St. Peter's that we see today. It's in fact the building that stands alongside it and is now the parish hall. The parish hall was opened in 1872 as a mission room, and it was run by the Reverend John Brereton. Now, Brereton had an enormous amount of social problems. He simply couldn't cope with them all on his own. And that's why Preedy was so important to him, to help him cope with this enormous load of pressure that he was under. Preedy also happened to be a very passionate sportsman. So it was only natural when he came to Barnsley that he should want to try and find out what the Barnsley Rugby Club was like. So he went along to make contact. But to his horror, when he got there, he discovered that they played rugby on Good Fridays. He could not play the game on the day that marks the crucifixion of Christ. And on principle, he walked away. As he was walking down the road, he happened to chance upon some youths who were standing outside a pub talking about the formation of a football club. Preedy stopped, his ears pricked up. This was something that really interested him. He joined in the conversation, and it quickly became obvious to these youths that here was the man to lead them. And so, on the 6th of September, 1887, Barnsley St Peter's Football Club was born. They chose that name because Preedy wanted to signal the commitment of the church to the community. The first elected officers were himself as financial secretary and John Brereton, who was the president. Preedy had many roles in the club. He wasn't just financial secretary, he was also a player. He recruited players, he arranged fixtures, and he secured match officials. But very importantly, he secured for the club their very first proper ground. From the steps of St Peter's here, he could see some open fields and thought that this is the place to play. He eventually approached the owner of the fields and after a lot of knockbacks secured a pitch in that area. The ground that they played on was to become the Oakwell Stadium. They played their first match on Saturday, the 17th of September, 1887. It was an away game to Manor House. The Saints, as they were originally called, obviously because of the saint in St Peter's, won 4-1. And Preedy played as a forward. Now, when it came to home games, there was a real problem because they had no changing facilities. Quite simply, the church was too small. And so they found the solution right here in the cellar of the Dove Inn. Isn't it ironic that the boys should change in the cellar of an inn? Because Preedy was a teetotaler. In fact, more than that, he was an active member of the temperance movement, which did its very best to try to keep people out of public houses and to keep them away from the demon drink. Preedy loved the rough and tumble of football as it was played at the time. In fact, it was more like rugby than the football we think of today. However, he expected the highest standards of sportsmanship, not just from the players, but also from the spectators. By 1890, they joined the Sheffield and District League and turned professional. And by 1898, they joined the second division of the Football League. But the significant year is 1893 for two reasons. First, it was when the club won its first trophy, the Barnsley Charity Cup. It was Preedy's parting gift to the club because he actually left that year to go to Islington. Now, it was interesting because when he left, people suddenly thought, this is our chance to start playing football on Good Fridays again, because of course Preedy wouldn't allow that while he was in charge. But just to show how closely that club was identified with Preedy, it took 4 years before its name could actually be changed and Good Friday football could be reintroduced. In 1897, Barnsley St Peter's Football Club became quite simply Barnsley Football Club. When Preedy left for London in 1893, it was in the full knowledge that he was embarking on a ministry that would stretch him to his limits. Islington had even greater poverty and deprivation than the St Peter's district of Barnsley. But his passionate love for the people he served, together with his indomitable faith in God, gave him the strength and inspiration to meet the enormous challenge that confronted him. After 4 years in his first parish in Islington, he was appointed priest in charge of the All Saints Mission here in White Lion Street. Now, the mission stood on this site, and it was nothing more than dilapidated cowsheds. His house stood here where we are at this moment, and it had no home comforts, no furniture. In fact, he slept on the floor with nothing more than his coat for a blanket. For the men of the district, he set up billiard tables in the crypt of his mission hall and also a boxing and wrestling ring. He himself was a very keen boxer and earned the nickname the Boxing Parson. Here he founded a sports club which was to become famous for the boxers and wrestlers it produced. Preedy explained how he combined religion and sport at the mission. Without giving the slightest offence, you can call ours the Costers Club. These are the men who would a short time ago have ridiculed the thought of darkening the doors of a church, but who are, by degrees, learning self-respect and realising that the Divine Master is their friend, and that true religion can be brought into their lives without spoiling their sports and pleasures. He had the window of his study specially converted into a bay so that he could see men entering the two pubs at the end of the street. One was the Three Johns here, which is now called the Hobgoblin, and the other is the White Lion at the other end of the street. Now, the reason for this was quite simply that the wives of the district would tell him if their husbands were going into the pubs to spend the weekly wage on drink instead of food and clothing for the family. When they told him, and he saw them going in, he went up to them and raised his fists. Now, he was only 5'5", but the neighbourhood toughs were all scared of him. And the moment he did this, they made a run for it. And that's how the weekly wage was saved. Preedy never forgot Barnsley Football Club, despite his total commitment to the people of Islington. If Barnsley happened to be in London for a match, he would go along to watch. And if friends came down, he'd invite them to his mission where they could enjoy watching boxing in the basement. He would also occasionally go up to Barnsley for important cup matches, and he certainly never failed to send a telegram of encouragement before every cup match. Well, how delighted he must have been when in 1912 Barnsley eventually won the FA Cup. The ball was presented to him at the Clarence Hotel, that's the club's headquarters, at a celebratory banquet after the game. And that ball was proudly displayed in his study in Islington until the day he died. He bequeathed it to the club in his will. And here it is, the very ball presented to Preedy. With me is Arthur Bauer, who for many years was the club's official historian and still does work for the club. Arthur, I believe your father and grandfather were at the final in which that ball was won. Can you tell me something about their memories?
Yes, I can, Peter. Obviously, it was won in 1912, and my father stood with my grandfather behind the goal where Barnsley scored the winning goal. And I've had a lot of tales, but the one that sticks in the mind mostly is, I think it was about 10 days after the Titanic sank, and the footballers of both Sheffield clubs were going around the ground with collection boxes. And my father always said, every time he puts money in a box when the Salvation Army call anything, that tinkling of boxes reminds him of that day, the day we won the cup at Bramall in Sheffield.
Well, that's a very unusual memory. Thank you very much, Arthur. Arthur's successor as Barnsley's official club historian is David Wood, who's here with me now. David, Barnsley acquired the nickname Battling Barnsley to get that ball and to bring it home. How did they get that nickname?
The nickname does come from the cup runs of 1910 and 1912, when they won by attrition rather than skillful play. In 1910, they reached the final and were very unlucky to concede an equaliser in the last minute. And in 1912, they played 12 games to win the trophy, 6 of which were 0-0 draws. In the month of April, when they won the cup, they also played 12 games, which included league games, which is still a record for a professional football club.
After the game, at the celebratory banquet in the Clarence Hotel, the club's headquarters, he set the club another target. He said to them, make sure you get into the First Division next year. Was his dream ever fulfilled, David?
Well, they came close the next season, and the season after they finished third, which gave them great promise for the years ahead. But unfortunately, the First World War took toll of that, and most of the team fell apart. And in 1919, when play resumed, it was a different Barnsley side out there. But yes, his dream was fulfilled. It took 85 years for Barnsley to reach the Premier League.
Although Barnsley was always to be a big part of him, Preedy remained in Islington for the rest of his life, faithfully serving his parishioners. In the final year of his life, he developed severe heart problems, but he worked on regardlessly right up until the day of his death in April 1928 at the age of 65. The Bishop of Stepney conducted his funeral service at the Mission Hall, which was absolutely crowded. But thousands lined the streets to say their farewells as the procession made its way to Islington Cemetery, and not a single costermonger stall was opened on the day. The Bishop of Stepney told the congregation, "You have had a great man in your midst. You have had a wonderful parish priest and a splendid friend." And then he went on to highlight one of Preedy's outstanding gifts. Father Preedy was a sportsman. He could talk to sportsmen. They and he knew that the real power of Father Preedy was his simple, natural, childlike love of the Lord Jesus Christ. It's little wonder that the name of this great man is still remembered with so much affection at Barnsley Football Club today. This is St Andrews, the home of Birmingham City. They're the first English club to ever reach a European final, the 1960s Fairs Cup, only to go down 4-1 on aggregate to Barcelona. The club is associated with such legendary names as Trevor Francis and Gil Merrick. Trevor Francis, held by many to be Birmingham City's best player ever, made his first team debut aged just 16 in 1970. He scored all 4 goals in the 4-0 win over Bolton at St Andrews on the 20th of February 1971, the first ever 16-year-old to do this in league football. In 1979, he became the first ever £1 million player when he transferred to Nottingham Forest. Back in the mid-50s, one of the top goalkeepers in the UK was reckoned to be Gil Merrick. He spent his entire career with Birmingham City, making a record 551 appearances between 1939 and 1960. He won 23 caps for England and played in the 1954 World Cup. He went on to manage the club for 4 years, winning the League Cup in 1963, Birmingham City's first major trophy. In 2011, the club won this trophy a second time when they beat Arsenal 2-1 in a nail-biting Wembley final, the winning goal coming in the dying minutes of the match. And this is where it all began. Holy Trinity Church, as it was called then, just a mile or so from St Andrew's Stadium. It was modelled on King's College Chapel in Cambridge, and when it opened in 1823, it could seat 1,700 people. In 1871, members of the choir formed a cricket team which they called Holy Trinity Cricket Club. 4 years later, in 1875, 6 of the choristers decided to form a football club for no other reason than to stay fit for the following cricket season. At the time, you see, cricket was the main sport in England and football was a new game of relatively little importance. These lads were a mixed bunch. The 6 of them were Billy Edmonds, the brothers Will, Tom and George Eden, and Fred and Tom James. Mixed in the sense that the eldest was Will Eden, 25, the youngest, Fred James, 16. But that didn't matter, because football at the time was all about fun, enjoyment. It wasn't a serious sport. It was too young. It hadn't yet taken hold. And those young cricketers who'd become footballers had set the ball rolling to become Birmingham City. They called themselves in the first instance Small Heath Alliance, after the area in which the church is situated. The first ever match played by the Holy Trinity Choir Boys, now playing under the name of Small Heath Alliance Football Club, was on a cold November afternoon in Arthur Street on a piece of wasteland around here. It was against a team from the Aston district called Holt Wanderers, and the result was a 1-1 draw. The scorer for Small Heath was David Keyes, who thus goes down as the first ever goal scorer in the history of Birmingham City. A year later, they were joined by Arthur James, the 19-year-old brother of Fred and Tom, and he was to become the first superstar in Birmingham City's history. He was one of these players who had everything. He had pace, incredible dribbling skills, unerring accuracy in his passing, and above all, a deadly shot. And with Arthur in the side, this team went from strength to strength. He scored the club's first ever hat-trick in 1877, and that was the year when they moved to Munt Street, which was to be their home for the next 29 years. A year later, they developed so much because of Arthur's influence that they joined the Birmingham and District Football Association. 1878 was a very pivotal year for the club, but it was also a very pivotal year in the church. That year, the Vicar of Holy Trinity, the Reverend Richard Enracht, became the victim of a carefully planned conspiracy. It started in Easter at the elections for church wardens. As was the usual practice, the vicar nominated his representative and the parishioners elected theirs, the people's warden. But unknown to anybody, at that particular election, a number of people had infiltrated the meeting to vote for John Perkins. Why did they cheat? Why did this happen? Quite simply because Perkins wanted to take the vicar to court because he was instituting what he believed were Catholic practices in the services of the church here. Why did he suddenly feel he wanted to do it now? Quite simply because in 1874, Parliament passed a law called the Public Worship Regulation Act, which prohibited any form of Catholic practices in Anglican services, and a vicar could be taken to court by the church warden under those rules. What duly happened was that following the procedures, Perkins reported Enracht to the Bishop of Worcester, and the bishop looked at the complaints and agreed that 4 of the practices perhaps were out of order. He wrote to Enracht and said he had to desist. After some time and prayer and consideration, Enracht agreed to do so. And as a result, the bishop said to Perkins, for the peace of the parish, stop the legal proceedings. But Perkins wouldn't. They'd started to roll. He wanted to see them through. He was determined that this man was going to prison. In 1879, Enracht was summoned to appear before the court, but he refused to attend because he said, a secular court has no spiritual jurisdiction over me. I will not accept its findings. He was ruled to be in contempt of court and sentenced to prison. A year later, it took that long, the prison sentence was to be operative. 1,000 parishioners assembled outside the vicarage next door to the church to give him a rousing send-off to the station at Bordsley, from where he took the train to enter Warwick Prison. It's difficult to imagine how those pioneers of Birmingham City Football Club must have felt. After all, as members of the choir, they'd taken part in these services that were deemed illegal. They also had a great love for their vicar. He was a man known to have had the esteem and affection of his parishioners. It did look at one point as if there was a chink of light, because after 7 weeks he was released from jail on a technicality. But unfortunately, no good was to come of this, because under the terms of the Public Worship Regulation Act, a vicar was required to resign from his parish after 3 years from the date that his prosecution was first announced. Shortly before this period was up, members of the parish had written to the Queen, to the Prime Minister, to the Archbishop of Canterbury, saying that their beloved vicar had been the victim of a carefully planned conspiracy, and it was not right that he should leave them. But it was to no avail. In March 1883, Enracht had to go. A few days after he was told to leave, the Reverend Alan Watts took his first service here. Thousands turned up in support of Enracht to protest against Watts's service. In fact, the police had to be called in to ensure that no harm could come to anyone. A few days later, at a packed meeting in a local school, the Holy Trinity parishioners said farewell to Richard Enracht. We can be sure that those pioneers of Birmingham City Football Club would have been among them. Enracht left for London. He finally went to St Swithin's in Bintry, Norfolk, which was his final parish. The Birmingham paper said at the time that he never got over those trying times, which are still referred to as the Victorian persecution. A tribute to Enracht was paid in The Guardian, and it stated, "The people have learnt to love and respect Mr. Enracht, who has laboured in his parish with unwearied kindness, and to value the many agencies for good which had grown up under his ministry." We can be sure that those words would have been endorsed by those pioneers of Birmingham City Football Club, who deeply loved their vicar. We can equally be sure that his courageous moral stand made a lasting impact on them.
The early players caught up in those events could never have dreamt that a great club like Birmingham City would emerge from the humble foundations they had laid. The Reebok Stadium, home of Bolton Wanderers Football Club. 3 times they finished as high as 3rd in the top flight of English football, but their greatest achievements have been in the FA Cup. They've appeared in the final 7 times, winning the trophy on 4 of those occasions. Without any doubt, their greatest ever player was Nat Lofthouse. Between 1946 and 1960, he scored a record 285 goals in 503 appearances. Between 1950 and 1958, Nat was capped 33 times for England, scoring 30 goals, one of the highest goals per game ratio achieved by any player representing England at senior level. Goalkeeper Eddie Hopkinson was another of the club's iconic players, who set the appearances record of 578, playing from 1952 to 1970. Eddie also earned 14 caps for England.
Former defender Sam Allardyce played 231 games for Wanderers in 2 spells from 1973 until 1986. He became manager in 1999 and in his 8 years led Bolton to the League Cup final in 2004 and into the UEFA Cup in 2005 for the first time in the club's history. He repeated this feat 2 seasons later. Their names are all here in the club's walkway of fame, just outside the main reception of the Reebok Stadium. And so too is this name, the Reverend Joseph Farrell Wright. He's the club's founder. The history of Bolton Wanderers started here. On this site stood a church called Christ Church, and in 1871 the Reverend Joseph Farrell Wright came here as vicar. It was a very poor and deprived area, many of the people earning their living from low wages in factories and mills that were nearby. It was a big sacrifice for Wright to come here with his wife and 4 young children. They'd been living in fashionable Silverwell Street, very close to St. Peter's Church, where he was working as an assistant curate. St. Peter's was the mother church of Bolton. But the call to the poor was irresistible, and Wright came here with his family. He built a deep, close relationship with the parishioners, who regarded him as a loving minister and firm friend. His concern for the poor was so great that he became actively involved with the Bolton Poor Protection Society, and he did whatever he could to help the people of this area, frequently visiting their homes and assisting in any way possible. Wright was to remain at Christ Church for the rest of his life, but remarkably, there is no known picture of him. The only record we have of him here are samples of his handwriting in the logbooks of the Boys and Girls School in the building that stood opposite, known as Christ Church Schools. It was Wright's friendship with the headmaster of the boys' school that was to lead to the birth of Bolton Wanderers. It was a very, very tough area, and it was a very, very tough job for the headmaster of that school, Tom Ogden, who came here a week before his 23rd birthday. It was so tough that they couldn't recruit teachers to help him, or if they came, they didn't stay for very long. It was a tough assignment. Behaviour was dreadful, punctuality was dreadful, gangs roamed the area who would sometimes disrupt the lessons. He couldn't even count on the support of parents because they would often keep the children away from school to earn extra money in the local factories and mills. But despite this, Ogden was able to improve things. He was a devout Christian, and on the strength of his faith, he was able to find the inspiration to turn things round. Within a year, the inspector's report said, "The tone of this school has improved." The real turning point came in 1871 when Joseph Wright was appointed vicar of Christ Church. With Wright behind him, the school went from strength to strength. In fact, the HMI reports indicate this very clearly. In 1872, the report read, "The order is good, the extra subjects were well done, and the results of the examination gave proofs of careful teaching." A year later, the inspection report read, "The order is good, and the boys are taught with much vigour and success." The report also noticed the spirituality in the school and recorded the following. The school as a whole did well. The influences at work in the school seemed to be of a directly religious kind. This obviously is a reflection of Tom Ogden's deep Christian faith. Well, Ogden was a great football enthusiast, and although Wright himself didn't play football, he didn't have great interest in the game in that sense, he was a believer that football could engender Christian qualities of character in young men. For example, courage, fair play, unselfishness, you play for the team, not for yourself, and self-control. Wright had heard that a new form of football was being played in the nearby village of Turton, and he wondered if this was something that the boys of the Christchurch Sunday School could take up. Intrigued at this prospect, he sent Ogden to Turton to investigate. It was played here on this pitch. It's been in continuous use since 1830 and makes it therefore the oldest pitch in the world with an ongoing use. Ogden gave an enthusiastic account of the game to Wright, and Wright thought, well, let's see if the Sunday school boys will go for it. And he asked Ogden to speak to them. They were enthusiastic. And in June 1874, Christchurch Football Club was born. Ogden was captain, Wright was president. Everything went really well with the new club for some 3 years, until it was plunged into crisis in 1877. The reason, quite simply, was that Wright, as president, took his role very seriously and insisted he should be present at all committee meetings. Now, the boys took exception to this. They wondered why he needed to be so authoritarian. Well, it's very likely it was because they'd been swearing on the pitch, some didn't attend meetings, and some didn't let the secretary know in good time if they couldn't turn up for matches. And with the club playing in the name of his church, I think it was very clear that Wright wanted to ensure that the good name of the church was not tarnished. The boys didn't like this at all and decided in the end they'd had enough. They were going to break with him and the church. And that's the decision they made. And so they realised they could no longer use the Sunday school building as their headquarters and had to find another. They found the Gladstone Hotel very close to Pikes Lane, where their pitch was. But then came the problem of a new name. At their final committee meeting at the Sunday school in August 1877, they had an inspired idea. Because they'd had to wander in search of a new home, they decided to call themselves Bolton Wanderers. Despite the change of name and the parting of the ways, Bolton Wanderers have never forgotten the debt they owe to Joseph Wright. After all, without him, the club just wouldn't exist. When I found his neglected grave in the churchyard here at Christchurch Walmsley, just outside Bolton, they immediately decided to restore it and add the words "Founder of Bolton Wanderers Football Club" to the inscription. In June 2008, a special service of commemoration was held here at the church for Wright, at the time his grave was rededicated. We've also seen that a memorial brick was placed in the Walkway of Fame outside the Reebok Stadium. These are all fitting tributes to the man who created their club. But perhaps the greatest tribute is seen today in the life and culture of the club, as its chaplain Phil Mason explains.
We here at Bolton Wanderers believe that we are in the heart of the community and we've got the community at our heart. And one of the schemes that has been introduced with the passion of Phil Gartside, our chairman, is that of working with young people who, for whatever reason, because of their background and their contacts, have actually been dropped out of formal education, and teaching them education but using sport as the vehicle to do that. So I find it fascinating that our founder, our history, is now being repeated and refreshed in a new and positive way for the 21st century. Within our squad there are people of all faiths and none, and some of those people take their faith very seriously and are very committed, and it's very important to them. And so, for example, before every first team game there is an opportunity for players to come and to gather for prayer. We never pray for a win, but we always pray for wisdom, for guidance, and for any matters that the players themselves bring to my attention.
In March 2012, one of those players, Fabrice Muamba, collapsed unconscious during a cup tie against Tottenham Hotspur. He was pronounced clinically dead for 78 minutes. The media went mad.
It's the only time I can remember that prayer and faith is on the front page of every British newspaper. Fabrice Muamba himself has got a very strong faith, as his family, and to be there at the bedside and to be praying with Fabrice and the family was an incredible privilege. There was no doubt in Fabrice's father's mind, Marcel, that prayer would be answered. There was no doubt in Shona, his fiancée's mind, that prayer would be answered. And it was incredible to see their strength of faith in the face of incredible adversity. It had a huge effect all around our players, our staff, our supporters.
Not least of all, the club's chairman, Phil Gartside.
The thing that really struck me on when Fabrice had his unfortunate illness was the fact that the power of prayer and the power of the faith that the people around him had, and made me realise that there was really something in this. So it's made a big difference to me.
If Joseph Wright were here today, he'd be very happy to hear words like these. I'm here at Goodison Park, home of Everton Football Club. Nicknamed the Toffees, they've played in the top flight of English football for well over 100 years, more than any other club. They've won the league title 9 times, reached the FA Cup final 13 and won it 5. The mid-80s saw the club's most successful period when they won 2 league titles, the FA Cup and the European Cup Winners' Cup. Everton can claim one of the most successful strikers in English football history, the legendary Dixie Dean. His league record of 60 goals in one season has never been beaten. Between 1925 and 1938, he scored an incredible 383 goals for Everton and 18 goals in 16 games for England. Alan Ball signed for Everton after winning the World Cup for England in 1966. One of the greatest midfield talents of his generation, he played 251 games for the club, scoring 79 goals from 1966 to 1971. He also represented his country on 72 occasions. Neville Southall, in the 1980s, reckoned by some to have been the world's best goalkeeper. Between 1981 and 1997, he played a record 751 matches for Everton, as well as a record 92 games for Wales. He played a big part in the club's phenomenal successes in the 1980s. Everton haven't always played here at Goodison Park. In fact, before they moved here, they were playing at another ground across Stanley Park. Now, that will come as a surprise, won't it? Because Anfield is the home of one of the most famous football clubs in England, if not Europe and the world, Liverpool. Liverpool have won 18 league titles, 7 FA Cups, a record 8 League Cups and 5 European Cups. Some of the stars who've worn the famous red shirt include 1966 World Cup winner Roger Hunt, who made 492 appearances between 1959 and 1969. His 245 league goals are still a club record. Ian Rush, a Welsh international, was another outstanding striker. He scored a club record of 346 goals in all competitions between 1980 and 1996 in 660 games. One of Liverpool's heroes has to be Kenny Dalglish, Scotland's most capped player with 102 caps. King Kenny played 516 games for the club, scoring 172 goals between 1977 and 1990. As manager, he won the league 3 times and the FA Cup once. His best season was 1985-86, when he won the league and FA Cup double. And who could forget Bill Shankly, loved and respected around the world as the man who pulled Liverpool out of the second division in 1962 to become a major force in English football. Now, how is it that both Everton and Liverpool have played here at Anfield? And are there any more surprising links between these two clubs? It's a fascinating story, so let's go back right to the beginning and find out. It all started here. On this site stood a Methodist chapel called St. Domingo. In July 1877, a new minister arrived. His name was Ben Chambers. He was a great Christian man, warm, caring, loving, and quickly drew people towards him. He had a particularly good relationship with young people in the church. By the summer of 1878, he persuaded members of the young men's Bible class to form a cricket club. They so enjoyed the game that they decided to take up football as a means of keeping fit during the winter for the following cricket season. And where better to do this at nearby Stanley Park. It had opened in 1870 and was a very popular attraction. It offered plenty of space for cricket and football. And the St. Domingo lads who came here to play thoroughly enjoyed themselves. Very mixed bunch. Alfred Riley Wade was 20, Will Cuff was only 10. They were both the sons of trustees of the chapel. Alfred Riley Wade was going to become, in time, one of the directors of Everton. Will Cuff, apart from being the chapel choir master, was also destined to be one of the most illustrious chairmen in Everton's history. The boys played here in the southeast corner of Stanley Park. They called themselves St. Domingo Football Club. The St. Domingo lads were actually pretty quick learners, and it wasn't long before they became recognised as the best team in the park. So much so that other clubs looked in their direction and thought, this is the team to play for. And before too long, St. Domingo Football Club had absorbed several players from other church teams. It became an embarrassment because before long there were actually more players playing in St. Domingo Football Club from outside the chapel than inside it. And it was felt that, to be honest about the situation, they should change their name. And they decided at their headquarters, the Queen's Head Hotel, in November 1879, to call themselves Everton. Before the start of the 1881-82 season, Tom Evans, one of the St. Domingo players, took a step that was to have historic consequences. It was going to change the football landscape of Liverpool, even England, forever. He invited a local brewer and future Lord Mayor of Liverpool, John Holding, to become the club's president. Holding lived here in Stanley House, and it overlooked the corner of Stanley Park where the St. Domingo boys were playing, so he was well aware of them, and he happily accepted their invitation to become president. His first season as president was very, very satisfactory. They won 15 out of 20 matches. But at the end of the 1882-83 season, unfortunately, they hadn't completed their fixtures before the end of the football season. And it meant overrunning into the cricket season, which was not allowed. Consequently, the club realised they had to move. They had to find another ground where this restriction would not be a limitation to them. Holding came to the club's rescue. He spoke to a friend of his, William Cruitt, and asked if the club could use a pitch owned by him, or a field actually owned by him, to be turned into a pitch. And William Cruitt agreed. So off they went, working hard during the summer months to turn this into a proper ground. And they had it ready in time for the start of the 1883-84 season. And what a great season it was. They won 14 of their 16 matches, and also their first trophy, the Liverpool Senior Cup. It looked as if everything was really going well, but unfortunately the club fell behind with rental payments to Cruitt, and he lost patience and said they had to go. Once again, Holding came to the club's rescue. He asked another friend of his, Joseph Orrell, a fellow brewer, if they could use a piece of land alongside Anfield Road and convert it into a ground. During the summer of 1884, they worked flat out and had it ready in time for the start of the 1884-5 season. And that ground is directly opposite Holding's house. It's called Anfield. Holding was a man of great energy, vision, ambition. And under his leadership, Everton became a force to be reckoned with. In 1885, they went professional. 1888, they joined the Football League. 3 years later, they became champions of England. It seemed as if nothing could hold them back. But then, a year later, in 1892, it all went wrong. The first reason was a rent dispute. The second reason was drink. There were many members of the Everton committee who were committed to the temperance movement, and they were unhappy at the fact that the Sandon licensed premises were the club's headquarters. The situation came to a head when Holding expelled Everton from Anfield. In return, he was expelled from the presidency. One of the committee, George Mann, had realised that the club would be asked to leave Anfield, and he had already preempted this by finding a field across Stanley Park in Goodison Road. And they took this field, turned it into a ground, and it became Goodison Park. Undaunted by the fact that most of the Everton committee had abandoned him and only 3 of the players remained loyal to him, Holding was determined to continue Everton Football Club here at Anfield. And he duly registered the club as a limited company and decided to carry on here. However, George Mann got wind of this and appealed to the Football Association, the game's ruling body, saying that this man had no right to our club's name. The Football Association upheld Mann's appeal, and Holding was told he had to find a new name for his club. At a meeting in his house, it was agreed that it should be called Liverpool. Well, it seemed that everything was in place, but there was a problem. There was no team. And so Holding asked his friend John McKenna to become secretary and manager of the club and invited him to try and assemble a team. McKenna immediately set off for Scotland, where it was known that there were tremendous players of great talent, and he recruited a whole lot of them. In fact, so many of them had the surname Mac that Liverpool Football Club became known as the team of the Max, and things just went better and better after one or two hiccups. But the pinnacle was reached in 1901 when Liverpool became champions of the Football League. Holding had now done it twice, once with Everton, once with Liverpool, here at Anfield. A year later, John Holding died, and his funeral took place at the Church of St Simon and St Jude, which stood on this site. His death proved to be a turning point in the relationship between Everton and Liverpool. The split had been bitter, but underneath there had been a growing spirit of Christian reconciliation and forgiveness. After all, George Mann was the organist at St Domingo. Will Cuff was the choir master. And slowly but surely there'd been a thaw. But it really went into a whole new dimension at the death of John Holding, because 3 Everton players and 3 Liverpool players carried his coffin into the church here. And the flags at Goodison and Anfield were flown at half-mast. That was the beginning of an accelerated process of healing that happened within the next few years. 2 or 3 years later, Everton and Liverpool started joint match programmes, which lasted for some 30 years. In 1906, Everton won the FA Cup. They knocked Liverpool out in the semi-final. But when Everton came back with the trophy, all the Liverpool directors were there at the station to welcome them. There was a joint Everton-Liverpool cricket team during the 1930s, and the friendship between the clubs began to deepen as a result of this spirit of reconciliation and forgiveness. We've seen this in more recent years after the tragedy of Hillsborough, when Everton and Liverpool supporters rallied round each other to give comfort and support. In July 2008, the 2 clubs were together once again as they organised a service of thanksgiving for the life of Reverend Ben Chambers, who'd set the ball rolling that led to their birth. It was held at Chaplain in Yorkshire, where he is buried. In that service of thanksgiving, Liverpool Chief Executive Rick Parry said the following words: "Through cricket and football, Ben Chambers showed his commitment to getting young boys off the street. He did not see football and faith as incongruous, but rather as complementary. On behalf of Liverpool and our neighbours Everton, we salute this caring and committed Christian man." What kind of a man was Ben Chambers? We get a very clear insight from his obituary in the records of the Methodist Church. He was a manly, affectionate, kindly, pleasant, happy, noble being, possessing a powerful and winning personality, faithful in all the relations of life, attentive to all duties, eager to serve, anxious to do good, delighting in the success of his friends, hospitable, a never-failing friend, and an honourable but formidable foe. He was one of the best of husbands and a model father. What was the bedrock of his life? Not only was he every inch a man, he was likewise, to the fullest measure, a Christian. His childlike faith in our Lord Jesus Christ was the blessing of his religious life. Back at Goodison Park, I caught up with Everton's chief executive, Robert Elstone. I was fascinated to know what part the social concern that motivated Chambers played in the club today.
Absolutely critical to us. We're known worldwide as the People's Club, and we haven't been awarded that title lightly. We've been awarded it because we care about our people, our community, and we regularly invest in those areas. And so we have the most wonderful community scheme, which is very diverse in its range of activities, which deals with the old and the young, with the needy, with people who need you know, a helping hand, and we're very, very proud of that, and we indeed have a reputation for doing that. I think Chambers would also be delighted to know that that work isn't just here in Liverpool, it's around the world, and so we've done fantastically great work in Thailand. We've worked on tsunami-ravaged communities on the Thai coast. We've done work in Shanghai with disabled people in Shanghai. We do work in Calcutta, helping young players take their first step into football. So, you know, Chambers' legacy is here and strong and now in Liverpool, but it's also being reflected around the world, and I would hope he would be very proud of that.
Craven Cottage, home of Fulham Football Club. To date, their greatest achievement is reaching the final of the Europa League in 2010 when they were narrowly defeated 2-1 by Atletico Madrid after extra time. The club has produced some outstanding players. England international Bedford Jezard played over 300 games for Fulham as a striker during the 1940s and 1950s, scoring 154 goals. He holds the club's post-war record for league goals in a season, 38 in 1953-4. Fullback George Cohen played 459 games for the club and was in England's World Cup winning team in 1966. But Johnny Haynes is arguably Fulham's greatest ever player. He holds the club appearance record of 658 games. An inside forward renowned for his exceptional passing skill, he scored 158 goals between 1952 and 1970. Haynes played 56 times for England, 22 as captain. He was the first player to be paid £100 a week back in 1961. The story of Fulham Football Club starts here at St Andrew's Church. It was a magnet for sports-minded clergymen. No fewer than 8 had some involvement with the club in its first 20 years. We're going to meet 2 of them. The first is the club's founder, the Reverend John Henry Cardwell. We don't tend to make an automatic connection between professional football clubs and Cambridge University. But the founder of Fulham Football Club was a student here at Gonville and Keys College. Cardwell was born on a farm near Sheffield in 1842, but while he was still a boy, his father decided to give up life as a farmer, move the family to Burnley and start a business as a coal proprietor. John attended Burnley Grammar School and was obviously a very bright boy. He was admitted here in 1861. On graduation, he felt called to the Anglican ministry, and in 1865 he was duly ordained. His calling took him to London, where he eventually set up a mission in Fulham, a district on the north bank of the River Thames. By 1874, because of the huge influx of labourers to the area, the mission had grown to such an extent that it became the parish of Fulham Fields, with Cardwell the first vicar. It was a tough parish with acute problems of poverty, overcrowding and drink. He did all he could to help. He particularly had a heart for young people and set up many organisations for them in the church. He also provided free meals for the poorest children in the neighbourhood. Cardwell wanted to do more for the youths of the church, especially those who attended the Sunday school here. And with this in mind, he approached Tom Norman, one of the Sunday school boys, with the idea of forming a cricket and football club. Norman responded enthusiastically, started to recruit players, and so the St Andrews Cricket and Football Club was born sometime, we believe, in 1879. Cardwell and Dr. Patrick Murdoch, one of the church wardens, showed their support by becoming patrons. The first pitch was actually right next to the Sunday school, and it was an area of rough land, which was so bad it was simply known as the Mud Pond. But by 1883, the boys had begun to take the game more seriously, and instead of just playing impromptu games among themselves, looked for a proper pitch where they could have organised games. 2 years later, they were good enough to actually merit match reports in the local press. A new curate was appointed at St Andrews, who immediately added status to sport at the church. His name was Peregrine Propert, and he was one of the top oarsmen of his generation. He came to assist here at St Augustine's, a mission opened by St Andrews. Shortly after his arrival, he became actively involved with the St Andrews Cricket and Football Club. He was a remarkable young man who made his mark in spectacular ways. Let's find out more about him. Propert was born in this house in 1861 in St David's, Pembrokeshire. It's Britain's smallest city. The cathedral here is the final resting place of St David, the patron saint of Wales. Propert was baptised and confirmed in the cathedral, and his father was the organist. His father was a very, very educated man. He had degrees from both Oxford and Cambridge, and he homeschooled Propert in the house in which he was born. As a teenager, like all teenagers, Propert wanted excitement. But for him, excitement meant danger, and he went out of his way to find it. Growing up so close to the Pembrokeshire coast, he became an exceptionally strong rower and swimmer. And at the age of 17, he offered his services to the St David's lifeboat station. He found it thrilling to row out in a crew of 10 and save lives in the most dangerous seas. He also loved rock climbing, and he frequently used to row across to Ramsey Island, where he would scale 400-foot vertical cliffs. For all the excitement and adventure that he found, there's one thing he just had to do. He wanted to be the first person to swim across to Ramsey Island, across the 1-mile treacherous Ramsey Sound. Because of its cross currents, it was deemed impossible to swim. But he did it at the age of 17. And it took 56 years before anyone else could repeat that, despite numerous attempts to do so. In 1881, Propert came here to Trinity Hall in the University of Cambridge with the intention of becoming a lawyer. He threw himself wholeheartedly into the social life of the college and the university. In fact, he was one of the founders of the Footlights Amateur Dramatic Society, which was the springboard for the careers of such famous people as Sir David Frost, John Cleese, Emma Thompson. But his particular passion was sport. He was an all-rounder. He represented Trinity Hall at football, he was a keen cricketer, but above all, he made his mark as an oarsman. He became captain of the Trinity Hall Boat Club, and his crew became the best in the entire university. Propert came to Cambridge with definite career plans in mind, but while he was here, his thinking was turned upside down. 3 students of Trinity College, which is where we are at the moment, played a big part in this. Propert writes about those days in the following way. My earliest intention was to take up law and politics, but fortunately, at Cambridge, I met a group of men who, although the leading athletes at the university, were also men of deep religious convictions. My association with them changed my outlook upon life. I felt there was something better to aim at than worldly success, and that was the service of God and my fellow men. The group that made such an impact on him have become known in history as the Cambridge Seven. These devout young Christian men caused a sensation in 1885 when they gave up fame and fortune to become missionaries in China. One of them was Charles Studd, a household name as one of England's foremost cricketers. As well as an England regular, he was also captain of Cambridge University. In January 1884, Studd heard the renowned American evangelist Dwight Moody speaking in London. As a result, his life was transformed. He wrote the following: "Formerly, I had as much love for cricket as any man could have. But when the Lord Jesus came into my heart, I found that I had something infinitely better than cricket." As a result of meeting these men and hearing things like this, Propert left Cambridge a convinced Christian. This restless thrill seeker had finally found heart's rest in a personal relationship with Jesus. He now, more than anything else, wanted to serve the poor in a deprived area. And it was here, at St. Augustine's Mission in Fulham, that he found his life's vocation. Not long after his arrival, he befriended some youths who worked in a local cab yard. These youths were looked down upon by respectable people as being hooligans. Propert opened a gymnasium for them here at the mission. Looking back on those days many years later, he wrote the following words: "Among them I worked and made some of my best friends. At this time I was rowing for the Thames Rowing Club First 8, and when I brought home silver trophies and cups, it produced great excitement and admiration. Propert in fact twice won the Grand Challenge Cup of the Henley Royal Regatta, which was quite an achievement in the world of rowing. My association with these young fellows produced much criticism from the respectable, some of whom went so far as to say I was not fit to be a clergyman and reported me to the bishop, Dr. Temple. I explained to Dr. Temple that I'd come not merely to preach, but to apply Christian principles as far as I could in Lily Road. I believe I convinced the good bishop that my critics did not really understand the gospel message, and here Propert quotes the words of Jesus: I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. I think even now the church has largely forgotten this truth. We are terribly respectable. Propert served St. Augustine's faithfully until his death at the age of 78. In the 1950 history of Fulham Football Club, tribute was paid to him for the incredible contribution he made to the club in its early years of its existence. With men like Propert, Cardwell and Murdoch behind the club, it made rapid progress. In 1887, the first trophy was won, the West London Association Cup. That same year, the club changed its name to Fulham St Andrews Football Club to avoid confusion with other clubs called St Andrews. In January 1889, the name was shortened to Fulham Football Club. However, this did not represent a break with the church because Cardwell remained president and Dr. Murdoch continued as a member of the committee. In 1894, the club started to look for a permanent home and found a derelict site here on the north bank of the Thames, where once stood a grand house owned by Lord Craven. It was called Craven Cottage. Now that's something of an understatement when you consider it was an impressive building with a large estate. After 2 years' hard work, the ground was finally ready and the name Craven Cottage was adopted. Now, many people think the ground is named after this building in the corner of the stadium, but they're wrong. It's actually the creation of an architect who thought it would be fun to build it on the site of the original Craven Cottage. It's always been used for the players' changing rooms. The man who set the ball rolling and made it all possible, the Reverend John Henry Cardwell, was president until 1890, when he left St Andrews to become rector of St Anne's in Soho, a very tough parish. When he died in 1921, at the age of 78, the Church Times paid the following tribute to him. Though ever a fighter for truth and right, he had the gift of being able to fight without bitterness and without losing friends. No priest in the London diocese was more universally beloved. And certainly supporters of Fulham Football Club have every reason to remember his name with gratitude. The Etihad Stadium, home of Manchester City. FA Cup finalists 9 times, winners 5. In the 2011-12 season, they won the Premier League title in spectacular fashion in the dying seconds of the final match. Their previous top-flight title was 44 years earlier in 1968, with arguably their greatest ever team. One of them, Colin Bell, was voted the club's all-time best player. Other legendary players include Billy Meredith, who won the FA Cup with City in 1904. He's widely considered to be football's first superstar. Bert Trautmann, a former German prisoner of war, played over 500 games for City. He famously broke his neck in the 1956 Cup final, but played on. This magnificent stadium, one of the biggest in the UK, was built to host the 2002 Commonwealth Games. But Manchester City haven't always played in such grand surroundings. In fact, the first match took place here on what was at the time an area of rough land. The match took place 13th of November 1880 against Macclesfield Baptist Church. The Baptists won the game 2-1, but the scorer for St Mark's was James Collinge, who therefore goes down as the first goal scorer in Manchester City's history. Now, this area of rough land is very close to St Mark's Church, which the boys attended. Why is it that Manchester City Football Club first played under the name of a local church? The story starts here. On this site stood St Mark's Church in West Gorton, and its first rector, who arrived in 1865, the Reverend Arthur Connell, was destined to become the first president of Manchester City Football Club. Now, Connell was a man who was deeply loved wherever he served, and people were always saddened when it was time for him to move on. For instance, when he was leaving the parish of Tullylush, which is in the north of Ireland, Connell himself was an Irishman. His parishioners were devastated, but Connell felt called to Harrogate, and so in 1859 he left Tullylish for 6 very happy years in his first parish in England. But when St Mark's opened here in 1865, he was invited to become its first rector, and he took this position. At the time, West Gorton was still a semi-rural district on the fringes of Manchester, but it very quickly was absorbed into Manchester and suffered all the same social problems that its neighbour Manchester had. This included, of course, poverty, terrible housing, people living in cramped, squalid conditions with poor sanitation, and it became a parish with many, many needs, and it really kept Arthur Connell busy. By 1879, things had gone from bad to worse. There were more problems. One was drink. Men were spending money on drink that should have gone on food and clothing. Another was gang warfare, again often fueled by drink. And it was clear that the people of the area were leading fairly desperate, meaningless lives. This was a situation that grieved Arthur Connell's eldest daughter, Anna, who was 27 at the time. She was convinced God wanted her to help these men. And convinced of this, she decided that the best way to help them would be to set up weekly working men's meetings at which she would share her faith in Jesus with them to give them hope and inspiration, and also to provide them with wholesome recreational opportunities as an alternative to the pub. Now that would have included things such as drama, singing, music, recitations, readings at the time. Anna set off, with her father's permission, to knock on the doors of all the houses in the parish, some 1,000 doors, quite an arduous task. And she said to them all, "Come to my meetings on a Tuesday, and I'm sure you will find this something very enjoyable." The very first Tuesday, she was to be bitterly disappointed because only 3 men turned up. And no doubt she questioned whether she was really doing God's will, or was it just some fanciful idea of her own. But she would not give up. She was so determined to help these men that she approached 2 senior officials of the church, Thomas Goodyear and William Beestow. Now, they were also senior officials at the Union Ironworks, which was the largest employer in the area, and Anna asked them to put out word of her meetings to the workforce there. Within a very short time, a matter of months, the 3 men had become 100. And among the people who joined those meetings were members of the St Mark's Juniors Cricket Club, which William Beestow had set up the year before. Anna had a profound effect on those men through her meetings. In fact, within only a few months of starting them, they wanted to express their gratitude, and they gave her a gift. 3 years later, the same thing happened. They presented her with a beautifully bound Bible. And may I quote the words that they said? They wanted to give them to her in gratitude for the spiritual good which many of them experienced under her earnest and fervent addresses. And then several of the men stood up and spoke of, quote, the benefit they derived from their weekly meetings. Anna was so overcome with emotion that she couldn't respond, and her father had to speak on her behalf. Well, early in 1880, William Beestow, who was giving Anna great help with her meetings, had the idea of starting a football club. The idea was that the cricketers, the St Mark's Juniors cricketers, should play football in the winter to stay fit for the following cricket season. And it was agreed enthusiastically by the cricketers that he spoke to, and so St Mark's West Gorton Football Club was born, and Arthur Connell agreed to be its first president. 3 name changes later, that little church club was to become known as Manchester City. It's amazing to think that it led to all this. What an incredible stadium. It all goes back to Arthur Connell, first president, in those early days at West Gorton. Although he didn't personally get things going, he was the man who endorsed the others who did. He was a great believer in the value of sport as a means of developing Christian character. And of course, by allowing his name to be attached to the club as president, and by letting it play in the name of the church, he was clearly making a statement of support. Anna, too, had a profound influence on so many of the players because they attended her meetings. The name Connell would have meant a great deal to those early pioneers. Now, Arthur, sadly, in 1897, became ill. He developed severe bronchitis and he lost his power of speech. And he had no option but to resign. This was something he didn't want to do. His parishioners didn't want it either. In fact, they really pleaded with him to stay, something we've seen has happened in other parishes. And at his farewell gathering, they said, "A man teaches by what he is." And the sight of Mr. Connell walking through the streets would have reminded the people that his life and example was one they could follow. They were happy enough for him just to be there because he was so loved and admired. But his doctor made it absolutely clear it was out of the question. When the farewell presentation was made to Arthur, he couldn't respond. He had no voice. But knowing this, he'd already prepared what he wanted to say and asked his son-in-law, the Reverend John Dixon, to read out on his behalf his words. And this is what he said. "I trust my preaching has been of no uncertain sound. Christ and him crucified was the theme on which I delighted to dwell, knowing there was no subject more saving in its power." Arthur moved for the good of his health to Southport, where it was felt that the sea air would do him good. It kept him going for another 18 months, but in February 1899, he died at the age of 77. So loved was he at St. Mark's that his body was brought back from Southport for his funeral at the church. That was 2 months before Manchester City were promoted to the top flight of English football for the first time. I wonder what Arthur, as president of that little St. Mark's football club, would have thought if he could see all this. We're at Loftus Road in West London, home of Queen's Park Rangers, nicknamed the Hoops after their hoop shirts. Queen's Park Rangers became the first third division club to win the Football League Cup when they beat West Bromwich Albion 3-2 in the final at Wembley in 1967, the winning goal being scored in the dying minutes of the match. It was an historical occasion, no less, because the Football League Cup final had never before been played at the National Stadium. A whole host of outstanding players has represented the club. Among them is England international Rodney Marsh, who signed as a striker from Fulham in 1966. Over the next 6 years, he made 242 appearances and scored 134 goals. In his first full season, 1966-67, he scored 44 goals in 53 games to help Queen's Park Rangers become third division champions and League Cup winners. Midfielder and former England captain Gerry Francis made his debut for the club in March 1969. He made 352 appearances in 2 spells up until 1982. He was captain during the 1970s and a key player in arguably the club's best ever side that finished runners-up in the old First Division in 1975-76. Stan Bowles, one of the club's most colourful characters, made 315 appearances and scored 96 goals playing as a midfielder or striker between 1972 and 1980. In a 2004 supporters poll, he was voted the club's best ever player. So, how did it all begin? Queen's Park Rangers' story begins with the creation of a pioneering housing estate in Kensal Green, West London. Built during the late 19th century, it was named after the monarch Queen Victoria. What made the Queen's Park estate so distinctive at that time was that its tree-lined streets, shops and parks were designed for working-class people, 16,000 of them. It had a high moral tone. There were no pubs, shops weren't allowed to sell alcohol, and any residents found drunk were evicted. This was home for most of the first Queen's Park Rangers players. The moral tone of the area was reinforced by the parish church of St Jude's, which stood on the edge of the estate. The population of the estate grew so rapidly that the vicar of St Jude's, Reverend Sidney Bott, decided to establish a St Jude's presence in the very heart of the estate. And in 1884, he opened this mission hall called St Jude's Institute. It became the headquarters of Queen's Park Rangers Football Club until 1898. In those early years, a company of the Boys Brigade was established here. That's an organisation designed to promote the Christian faith among boys. And one of the members of the Boys Brigade company here at St Jude's Institute was Jack MacDonald. He was to become one of the founders of Queen's Park Rangers. Jack was born in Glasgow in 1869, but as a young child he left Scotland with his family to move here to the Queen's Park estate in London. He became a pupil of Droop Street Board School, and it was in the playground of this school that he discovered a passion for football that he was never to lose. He spent every spare minute he could in the playground playing football, and of course after school as well with his friends on any open space they could find. By his mid-teens, Jack was ready for something better. He wanted to play organised football on a regular basis. And sometime in 1885, he spoke to his friend Fred Weller about this, and they agreed they should form a football club. And where else to find a willing squad of players but from among their friends in the Boys Brigade at St Jude's Institute. The players all agreed that their club should be named after the place where they all frequently met, St Jude's Institute FC. St Jude's Institute is now called St Jude's Hall. The vicar gave his full support to the club by allowing them to use St Jude's Institute as their headquarters, and also by allowing them to use the name of the church in their title. Well, as was common at the time, it was a team of very mixed ages, ranging from 12, unbelievably, up to 20. The very first match report I've been able to find was February 1886, an away match against Vulcan FC 3rd 11. Vulcans won 4-0. So quite clearly, St Jude's Institute had a long way to go before they would be a force in local football. In March 1886, a month later, St Jude's played their great rivals, Christchurch Rangers. This match was to have huge significance. Christchurch Rangers had been formed in 1882 from a boys' club started at the Christchurch Mission on the nearby College Park estate. Well, after the match, George Woodhouse, one of the founders of Christchurch Rangers, proposed that the two clubs should merge. The idea was that the two combined would be much stronger than either of them separately. He put the idea to the two sides and a merger was agreed and it went ahead. But there was a big problem. The name St Jude's Institute continued to be the name of the new club, and St Jude's Institute was also the headquarters of the new club. Not surprisingly, some of the Christchurch Rangers players felt they'd been victims of a takeover and they walked out angrily. To help the remaining members of Christchurch Rangers feel fully included in the union, it was absolutely essential to find a name for the new club that was acceptable to everyone. Now, as most of the players all lived on the Queen's Park estate, the inspired solution was to incorporate the name of the estate into the title and to couple it with the word Rangers to show continuity with the former Christchurch Rangers. And so, the new name, Queen's Park Rangers, was born. Reverend Sidney Bott gave his full support to the new Queen's Park Rangers Football Club. He allowed them to continue using St Jude's Institute as their headquarters. That same year, 1886, a new curate joined the church. His name was Gordon Young. Gordon was a footballer and he joined the club as a centre forward. He was a goal-getter and he certainly put those goals away. But more importantly, he was a great leader and he had this ability to combine the two factions of the club that had previously been suspicious of each other. With Gordon at the helm there, the club went from strength to strength. And when he left 2 years later to become a rector elsewhere, it would have been a great loss to Queen's Park Rangers. Nevertheless, Queen's Park Rangers Football Club went from strength to strength. In 1898, they became professional and also became a limited company. And this meant, of course, an official parting of the ways with the church. However, in 2011, on the 125th anniversary of the club, it publicly acknowledged its debt to the church when a plaque was unveiled on the St Jude's Institute building by Queen's Park Rangers legendary player Stan Bowles. During the ceremony, Andy Evans, the chief executive of Queen's Park Rangers in the Community Trust, spoke of Sidney Bott, saying, "If it wasn't for the foresight of the reverend gentlemen of the parish, it is very unlikely that Queen's Park Rangers Football Club would have come into existence and developed into one of the country's top 20 sides." Today, the club has a football outreach development manager, Dave Robinson. He spearheaded the erection of the plaque. I asked him what the community's response was.
It was fantastic, to be fair. Obviously, the club being formed in Queen's Park, at the time of the unveiling of the plaque, we didn't have too much presence in the area. We had in years gone by, and then it just sort of went a little bit quiet. So I think in terms of us coming down and unveiling the plaque, there's a real sense of belonging within the Queen's Park community. And I'm pleased to say, since we've unveiled the plaque, you know, there is a legacy in place. We've worked on a number of projects with the local area, and we'll continue to do so moving forward.
Someone very much involved with the club's local community is the chief executive of its community trust, Andy Evans, who gave that eulogy to Sidney Bott. Andy, as you know, Queen's Park Rangers is a club of church origin, and at the time it was founded, the church had a huge impact. To what extent is that spirit still alive in the club?
Well, I'd say that the spirit is very much still in existence, because what I would say is, and I often describe it as that, that community work and having the roots in the community, and in our case, you know, via the church in Queen's Park originally, you know, it's very much part of the club's DNA.
Do you have problems with drugs in the locality, and do you do anything perhaps to try and help that?
We do. There are some challenges. You know, we've got a housing estate across the road, the White City Estate. It's an area that does suffer from poverty and the different challenges that go with that. So we do workshops around not just drugs, but maybe you know, dangers of joining gangs, alcohol awareness, even touching on you know, other healthy lifestyle aspects as well. So it's, you know, we try and use the power of football to try and get those messages across to young people.
But what about the players' needs? The pressures they face today were not even imagined in those early days, something the club's chaplain, Bob Mayo, is well aware of.
The players, when they come to it, have to live this double world of confidence and vulnerability. You've got to be confident to go in for the tackle, but you're always vulnerable at the risk of injury or short-term contract. And again, there's a realm of sort of continuity the chaplaincy provides. It's that sense of being alongside people which is very important. And when crisis happens, when something different happens, we've got our relationships in place. That's sort of critical for the club. Again, because of this strand of confidence and vulnerability that goes down, it's a good thing for the club. The religion, the Christian faith, provides the safety net, the reassuring presence.
The Christian presence at the club today can trace its roots all the way back to the Victorian era. We're at the St Mary's Stadium, home of Southampton Football Club. And there at the entrance, Ted Bates, Mr Southampton, so called because under his management the club rose from the lowly 3rd Division to the 1st in 1966. The club made it through to the FA Cup final on 4 occasions, once as winners. This was in 1976, when the Saints created one of the biggest shocks in the history of the FA Cup final by beating Manchester United 1-0 to win their first major trophy. United had finished 3rd in the 1st Division that season, while Southampton had finished 6th in the 2nd Division. Southampton have had many great players. Terry Payne holds the club's appearances record of 713. An England international, he was in the squad that won the 1966 World Cup. Mick Shannon is the club's top goal scorer, 185 goals in 510 games between 1964 and 1977. He played 46 times for England. Matt Le Tissier, another Southampton legend, achieved the distinction of being the first midfielder to score 100 goals in the FA Premier League. He played for the Saints from 1986 to 2002. In August 2001, after more than 100 years of playing at the Dell, Southampton Football Club marked the opening of their new stadium in a friendly match against Spanish side Espanyol. The stadium's name was St Mary's. A significant choice of name because the club had been formed at St Mary's Church. It had played under the St Mary's name for 12 years, and the nickname, the Saints, comes from the saint in St Mary's. Symbolically, we can see the spire of St Mary's from the ground. This is where it all began. As the Mother Church of Southampton, St Mary's has always enjoyed considerable prestige, being used for important functions such as the induction of the mayor. But around the time the football club was born, its parish included many slums where some of Southampton's most socially deprived people lived. The rector during that period was Basil Wilberforce. He was to become Southampton Football Club's first president. He was born in 1841 into an illustrious family. His grandfather was William Wilberforce, who led the movement that brought about the abolition of the slave trade. And he was the godson of Queen Victoria. Wilberforce came to St Mary's in 1871 at the age of 30. The vast majority of his parishioners were very, very poor and deprived, but a significant number of his congregation were wealthy people who lived outside the area. It was not uncommon in Victorian times for the privileged to worship at and serve in a church in a deprived area. The sense of mission among the respectable to the poor was very strong. Of course, not everyone who attended this church did so out of noble ideals. Some, no doubt, came here just because it was the place to be seen. But Wilberforce would have frowned on such an outward show of Christianity. In the parish magazine, he made it perfectly clear what he considered a true Christian to be. Personal fellowship with Christ is the secret of quietness and peace among brethren. In like manner, it is the source of heart rest in difficulties. To be a Christian is not to profess a faith or to conform to a creed. It is the acknowledgement of a close connection between Christ and the soul. It is not the imitation of a perfect model, but the indwelling of a spiritual power. Now, Wilberforce himself needed the indwelling of a spiritual power to help him in his struggle against the enormous social difficulties that he met on his very doorstep. He met with fierce opposition and abuse from many quarters. Brewers and publicans were hostile towards him because of his firm stand against drink as a cause of great social misery at that time. A correspondent wrote to a local newspaper, bitterly complaining that Wilberforce failed to keep his churchyard free of prostitutes. But instead of taking offence at that letter, Wilberforce quoted words from it in the parish magazine and said, "There is enough truth in them to make every Christian in St Mary's throw aside indifference and plunge into God's battle." But in fact, St Mary's had already plunged into God's battle. Under Wilberforce's leadership, numerous organisations were set up targeting specific social needs in the parish. But the organisation that will most interest supporters of Southampton Football Club is the Young Men's Association. It was the cradle of their club. Among the activities of the YMA was a cricket club. By November 1885, its members felt the time had come to form a football section, and they held a meeting at the Grove Street School to discuss the idea. It was chaired by the Reverend Arthur Barron-Sole, himself a very keen sportsman. He was the warden of the YMA. The idea met with approval, and so the St Mary's Young Men's Association Football Club was formed. And here, at Hoglands Park, was an ideal venue for training. Basil Wilberforce was invited to become the president, a position he held for the next 9 years. He wasn't actively involved in the running of the club, but he did give it his full support. He was a firm believer that sport could be a vehicle for the development of Christian character, particularly qualities such as courage, fair play, unselfishness, and self-control. Dave Jewson is one of the club's official historians, and he told me about their very first trophy.
They used to play here on the common all their matches. They had to hire pitches around the ground when they entered for the Hampshire Junior Cup the first year it was competed for. And I think it surprised most people when they actually got through to the final. Played another local club called Southampton Harriers, who started life as Temperance Athletic Club. And they had to have a replay after a 2-2 draw at the county ground, and Saints prevailed.
So what year was that?
That was 1888.
And that was the first trophy that the club...
That was the first club. They won the Junior Cup 3 years running, won it outright, and then they won the Senior Cup, Hampshire Senior Cup. This is 2 years running.
And then, of course, things just went from there.
That's when they started getting interested to get professional. Yeah. Southern League started. They went into that. They were very successful. They were top 3 for the first 2 seasons.
Well, thank you very much, Dave.
Cheers. It was a very pleasure.
The club went from strength to strength during Basil Wilberforce's presidency, but in June 1894, he left to become a canon of Westminster Abbey. That same year, the club changed its name to Southampton St Mary's and joined the First Division of the Southern League. Wilberforce was succeeded as president by Russell Bencraft, who served St Mary's Church faithfully throughout his life. Bencraft had been involved with the Young Men's Association from the very start. He was a prominent member of the committee. He also happened to be a brilliant all-round sportsman. He excelled in many sports, not just as a player, but also as an administrator. He also achieved distinction in his career in medicine and in business. And in 1924, he was awarded a knighthood. The club flourished under Bencraft's leadership, culminating in winning the championship of the First Division of the Southern League in 1897. But it had become obvious that the club had outgrown its humble church roots. And so the decision was taken at the 1897 annual general meeting to form a limited company called Southampton Football Club. After 12 years playing under the name of St Mary's, the formal link with the church was now broken. But not entirely. The nickname The Saints, from its St Mary's days, lives on in the name of the stadium, an apt reminder of the historical link between club and church. And on the 125th anniversary of the club's birth, a service of thanksgiving was held at St Mary's Church. With me is Julian Davis, the Rector of St Mary's. Julian, you're Basil Wilberforce's successor. How do you think he would have felt when you organised those 2 services?
Well, I hope he would have been very pleased, because when Basil supported the setting up of the clubs, including the original Saints Club, he envisaged that sport should be a vital aspect of Christian life, and faith was intimately related to sport. And so I think he would like the fact that we were giving thanks to God for 125 years of the Saints.
Do you think there are any other opportunities of deepening the links with the Saints?
There are increasing possibilities, not least because the club has returned, of course, to the St Mary's Stadium, to its original parish, but also as it becomes more successful, then there will be more pastoral opportunities with more people coming into the area. And the Saints Foundation is a wonderful organisation which was set up by the club, which has a great effect in the communities of Southampton, and that parallels some of the communitarian work of the church.
When the name St Mary's was chosen for this grand stadium, the historic link between the club and the church of its birth was publicly recognised. we're at the county ground, the home of Swindon Town Football Club. I expect that for most Swindon supporters, 2 seasons in the modern era will really stand out in their memories. The first is the 1968-69 season when, as a 3rd Division side, Swindon Town defeated the mighty Arsenal of the 1st Division 3-1 at Wembley to win the Football League Cup.
Very nearly through. Rogers! A goal by Rogers! Beautiful play!
And of course, the other great season is 1992-3, when Swindon Town achieved promotion to the top flight of English football for the first time in their history. Swindon Town have had a number of greats on their books. Fullback John Trollope holds the record for appearances, having played 889 first-team matches between 1960 and 1980. He also holds the English record of 770 league games for a single club, an achievement that earned him the MBE. Harry Morris is the club's record goal scorer, scoring 229 goals between 1926 and 1933. In his first season, he scored 47 league goals, still a club record. Winger Don Rogers is widely regarded as one of Swindon's best ever players. In 2 spells with the club, he made 490 appearances and scored 181 goals. The story of Swindon Town Football Club begins in 1879 with the arrival in Swindon of William Baker Pitt as curate of Christ Church. It was a very brave move on 23-year-old Pitt's part, because this was a turbulent parish. Curates came and went in quick succession. The bishop regarded this as the one black spot in his diocese. The reason for this unsettled state of affairs was the fact that the vicar, Henry Bailey, had frequent run-ins with powerful figures in the community. However, Pitt established a very good working relationship with him, and they got on well. Pitt also became a very popular figure in the parish, particularly among young people who regarded him with affection and respect. When Pitt arrived in Swindon in 1879, he found there wasn't just division in the parish, there was also division in the town. In fact, Swindon wasn't just one town, it was 2. Originally, it had been a small market town up on a hill, but with the arrival of the Great Western Railway Works in the 1840s, there was such an influx of workers that the houses and other amenities built for them actually became a town larger than the original old town up on the hill. Just as there was a physical divide between the 2 communities, there was also considerable mistrust between them. Pitt, just as he'd been able to rise above the difficulties in the parish, also was able to do so within the town. He wanted to build a bridge between the 2 communities, and he did this through football. In the autumn of 1879, Pitt persuaded some youthful employees of the GWR Railway Works to meet with him here in Old Town at King William Street School. Now, this was quite an achievement because these young men lived in Newtown and there was a great divide between the 2 communities. After a lively discussion, it was agreed to form a football club and to call it Swindon Town Football Club. Obviously an astute choice of name because it embraced both Swindon Old Town and Swindon New Town. The first match played by the new club was on the 29th of November 1879. Sadly, it ended in defeat for Swindon, 4-0 away to Rover, although Pitt was singled out for his excellent play in the local press. Pitt continued to play for the club and to run it until 1882, when he left Swindon to become rector of All Saints in Liddington. However, he never lost touch with the club or his affection for it, and the club never forgot its debt to him. The club had made good progress under Pitt's leadership, And they continued to do so after he left for Liddington. In 1886, the Wiltshire Senior Cup was introduced, and Swindon Town Football Club virtually made it their own. They won it for the first 7 years of its existence. By 1894, the club had become good enough to start employing professionals and was also admitted to the First Division of the Southern League. The one thing that was missing, however, was a ground of their own. And it was in 1896 that Thomas Arkle, a local brewer, loaned the club enough money to build a stand on a site at the county ground. And this is the stand named after him. The club have played here at the county ground ever since that time. Swindon made slow but steady progress in those early years at the county ground. It wasn't until 1910 that they actually made any great impression on the national stage. That year, they reached the semi-final of the FA Cup. They repeated the feat 2 years later, and sandwiched in between, in 1911, was winning the championship of the First Division of the Southern League. That period was the club's pre-World War I glory days, and they were marked significantly by the selection of the legendary Harold Fleming for England, the only Swindon player to play for England while actually with the club. This statue of him was erected at the county ground in his honour. Fleming was a brilliant inside forward. He scored 204 goals in 336 games for Swindon Town. But in addition to being an outstanding footballer, he was also a devout Christian. He was known throughout the world of football for his refusal to play matches on Good Friday or Christmas Day. But much more than that, he had a reputation for scrupulous fair play and gentlemanly conduct. He was known as one of the fairest players in English football. As one correspondent wrote to the Swindon Advertiser on his death, "It can be said with all truth that he let his light shine before the public. By his life and influence, which radiated over every football ground, he left an indelible impression. Thus he leaves the world a better place for passing through." Another expression of Fleming's Christian faith was his commitment to young people. When his own training at the county ground was over, he would often return just to coach the younger players. And he also spent many hours here at the youth club of St. Mark's Church, where he worshipped. The young people adored him. They thought that he was a marvellous person because of the way he loved and treated them. And they affectionately always referred to him as our Harold. The Southern League Championship success achieved by the club in 1911 was celebrated here at the county ground on the 22nd of September that year in front of thousands of Swindon supporters. The principal guest of honour was the club's founder, William Pitt, and in his address he said the following: "No one congratulates the team more than I do upon the success which it has achieved. But perhaps there is one thing I congratulate the club upon more than upon its success, and that is its possession of a personal influence, which I understand makes for sobriety, purity, and the right observance of the Sunday. And I have no hesitation in saying that the success which has attended the team is very largely due to that influence." Now, the influence to which he was referring was the Christian ethos of the club. And there's no doubt that in his and everybody else's mind, the player that most embodied that spirit was the legendary Harold Fleming. One of William Pitt's successors at Christchurch is the vicar, the Reverend Simon Stevenette. Appropriately, Simon is also the club's chaplain. I asked him if there was anything left of that strong original link between church and club.
Absolutely, Peter. The Christian faith and the club, it's all part of serving the community. I mean, in my time at Swindon Town, I think I've seen probably about 11 managers and 10 chairmen go for only one chaplain has actually stayed that course of time. And there have been some tough times. We've seen relegations, we've seen a promotion. And what I try to do in my ministry at Swindon Town is to support people and remind them that God is with them in both the good times and the hard times.
Pitt served faithfully at All Saints Liddington for 54 years. As a man of deep spirituality, he had no time for the outward show of religion. He often said he would rather present one candidate for confirmation who had truly made a surrender of the heart to God than 50 who had not. In 1935, sadly, he had to resign as rector because of ill health. He developed severe bronchial problems. And on the 21st of November, 1936, he died of pneumonia. The Bishop of Malmesbury, who conducted the funeral service, told the congregation that they'd lost a real, kind friend. And Swindon Town Football Club have never forgotten that he was their real, kind friend too. On the 75th anniversary of his death in 2011, the club restored his grave and arranged a special Thanksgiving service in his honour in the church. With me is Nick Watkins, the Chief Executive Officer of Swindon Town Football Club. Nick, what for you represents continuity with what Pitt stood for?
Well, what he stood for was a community spirit, and to act as the glue in a fractured community at the time that he founded the football club. And what we have tried to do over the last 3 or 4 years is revisit that whole issue of community and use the football club as a means of galvanising a community and giving them a purpose and a compass that for many people is absent in their lives today.
Do you feel that to some extent football's lost its way? Is there a moral compass missing?
I think sadly when you get all of the media interest in football and it's mainly centred on what players are earning and their activities off the field and sometimes on the field, one questions whether football really is lacking a moral compass. And I hope that by revisiting and resurrecting the likes of a William Pitt and what he meant to this community will return that moral compass to football.
We're at White Hart Lane, home of Tottenham Hotspur, one of England's most successful clubs. Spurs have appeared in the FA Cup final 9 times, winning the trophy 8. The first time was in 1901, when they were still members of the Southern League. They remain the only non-league club to win the FA Cup since the formation of the Football League in 1888. In the 1960-61 season, they became the first club in the 20th century to achieve the League and FA Cup double. Spurs were the first British club to win a UEFA club competition, the European Cup Winners' Cup in 1963. They were also the inaugural winners of the UEFA Cup in 1972, becoming the first British club to win 2 different major European trophies. A whole galaxy of stars has played for Spurs. The legendary Jimmy Greaves scored a club record 266 goals in 379 matches in the seasons between 1961 and 1970, a record that's never been beaten. His total of 357 goals makes him the highest goal scorer in the history of English top-flight football. Midfielder Steve Perryman, another club icon, made a club record 854 first-team appearances between 1969 and 1986. And then there's Glenn Hoddle, considered one of the most gifted footballers of his generation. He made 490 appearances between 1975 and 1987, scoring 110 goals, while for England he played 53 games and became their manager in the late 90s. Here under this lamppost, one day in August 1882, Tottenham Hotspur Football Club was born. A dozen youngsters, all in their early teens, met here at the junction of Tottenham High Road and Park Lane to discuss the formation of a football club. They already existed as a cricket club called Hotspur Cricket Club, named after Harry Hotspur, who was famed for his exploits in battle and immortalised by Shakespeare. They felt that cricket was such a great game, they wanted to stay fit for the following season by playing football in the winter months. And so they decided to call themselves Hotspur Football Club. A month later, they were ready to play their first match. Not far away was the River Lee, which created the Tottenham Marshes, on which they found ample space on which to play. Their first match here on the Marshes was a 2-0 defeat to a local side called Radicals. Shortly after, they were thrashed 8-1 by a side called Latimer. Now, these defeats didn't in any way dampen their enthusiasm, but something else did. Before each match, they would carefully get the pitch ready, mark it out, only to find that older boys would kick them off and take over the pitch for themselves. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, other youths who roamed the marshes looking for trouble would stand on the touchline hurling abuse at them. Many of them lost heart and decided to leave the club, and it looked very much as if the club was going to fold. Many of the boys attended a Bible class here at All Hallows Church. In the summer of 1883, they turned to their Bible class teacher, John Ripshire, for help. He was like a father to them, and they had great love and respect for him. Ripshire not only ensured that they could play on their pitches, but he also organised them into a proper club with a proper committee, and he himself was elected president and treasurer. This was their headquarters. It was the YMCA building at the time. Ripshire was a member of the council of the YMCA, and he arranged for this building to be used as their base. They had their committee meetings here, and they also played football in the basement. Now, unfortunately, these boys were not very well behaved. They continually broke all the rules of the YMCA. They played cards, they stole berries from the mulberry bushes, and above all, they made a terrible din when they were playing football. In the end, they were expelled from these premises. But despite being let down and embarrassed by those boys, Ripshire stuck with them. Now, that was a remarkable thing to do in Victorian times, because his reputation would have suffered by his continued association with young hooligans. But Ripshire was a devout Christian. He showed these boys the unconditional love of Jesus, who accepted people just as they were. Ripshire went to the vicar of All Hallows Church, the Reverend Alexander Wilson, and asked if the boys could use a building owned by the church as their new headquarters. Well, obviously, Wilson must have had some doubts because of the boys' reputation, but he agreed on condition that they would attend a service here at All Hallows each Wednesday evening. They agreed to this and everything went ahead. And it looked as if this would be the beginning of a happy story. But unfortunately, after only 2 years, the boys let themselves down again, and Ripshire too. Wilson saw some of them playing cards in a pew at the back of the church. That was it. They were once again expelled from their headquarters and had to look for a new base.
Ripshire did not abandon them. He found a new base for them at the Red House Coffee Palace, adjacent to Spurs' present White Hart Lane ground. The building is still in the club's hands and is used as offices.
There's no doubt that Tottenham Hotspur Football Club wouldn't exist today if John Ripshire hadn't stood by those boys when he did. Despite their problems off the pitch, Spurs made incredible progress on it under Ripshire's leadership. In fact, so strong were the foundations he laid that in 1901, less than 20 years after the club had been formed, they were winners of the FA Cup. Well, Ripshire himself in 1894 decided to step down as president, although he did continue his association with the club as a patron. He left an incredible legacy. 6 of the boys who were with him from the very beginning became members of the management committee in 1895 when the club turned professional. And 3 years later, when they became a limited company, 2 of those boys became directors. But it wasn't just those sorts of foundations he laid that are his legacy. It was something else. Under his leadership, Spurs acquired the reputation of being the most popular club in England for their fair play. Quite simply, if you cheated, if you were dirty, you couldn't get into the Spurs team. In 1948, Fred Ward wrote a history of the club, and he looks back on Ripshire's contribution and writes this: "Let us pause a while here and think of what that excellent Mr. Ripshire did. He started a tradition at the Hotspur Club which has been maintained up to the present day, for in my opinion, Tottenham Hotspur Football Club have done much to perpetuate the best possible spirit in the playing of professional football."
Ripshire had well and truly left his mark on the club, but what became of the great man after standing down as president?
His trail led me here to Dover. What was the clue that brought me here then? Well, it was an extract I found in the 1908 history of Tottenham Hotspur, written by 2 of Ripshire's earliest players. Mr. Ripshire was our president and true friend. He was with us, wet or fine, year in and year out, every night until 10 o'clock. He was the real father and founder of the Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, and without him, there would be no Hotspur Club today. It came as a great shock to us to learn that he's now living at Dover in humble circumstances and totally blind. And that was the last the club ever heard of him. My investigations revealed that he never married and left London in the late 1890s to live with his sister and her family in the Diamond Hotel. His brother-in-law was the proprietor. Sadly, by 1906, the hotel's business had collapsed and the family was reduced to poverty. It had a devastating effect on Ripshire's health. The strain was simply too much for him. He was admitted to the workhouse in Dover. It's now the Buckland Hospital. It shows the extent to which the family's fortunes had plummeted, that the workhouse provided free medical care for the poor and destitute of the town. Ripshire was admitted there in January 1906 and stayed until September of that year. However, his health continued to deteriorate and he was readmitted the following March. This time, he was never to leave. He died there on the 24th of September 1907, aged 67. He was buried 4 days later in an unmarked pauper's grave here in St Mary's Cemetery in Dover. When the Tottenham Tribute Trust heard of his plight through my book Thank God for Football, they immediately responded by commissioning a headstone for him. It was dedicated on the centenary of his death, the 24th of September 2007. The ceremony was attended by officials of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club and many of their supporters who travelled long distances. They'd come to honour an exceptional man. John Ripshire had shown unconditional Christian love to undeserving youngsters at critical points in the club's history. Had he not done so, there would be no Tottenham Hotspur Football Club today.